Hi everyone, and welcome to week 6 of the vlog series here at Embodied Beings. My name is Alexa, and this week I am coming at you halfway through this summer series on how yoga therapy works with the topic of psychological flexibility, transitions, and yoga. And this is inspired by a lot of my past patterning, but also most recently by my life in the past couple of weeks. Apologies that this video is coming a little bit later this week, but I was prioritizing some connections with friends and my own personal health and well-being as I started the big transition from the West Coast back to the East Coast. I just landed in New York this morning on a red eye from the West Coast, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in the next couple of weeks, what brought on the transition, and what I'm going to be offering here in the next coming months. But today we'll focus on psychological flexibility, what it means, how it's relevant to our daily lives, to optimal health, but also living like not only comfortable, but really joyous, ecstatic lives. And of course, the yoga and the science behind it. So how we can use yoga as a tool to train ourselves physiologically and also psychologically to be able to better adapt to change and the fluctuations of our daily lives. I'll start with a quote by Charles Darwin, his most famous quote, which is, "It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." And we see this not only in the animal kingdom and in human beings, but also like all around us in nature. I've spent the past 2 months living off-grid and being in or around gardens pretty much every day, and I see this all the time, like with the resilience of plants and seeing which one survives and which ones don't, and just observing this brilliantly intelligent adaptability of life and growth. And I'd like to kind of root that into what it can mean for us as we move forward and we evolve individually, but also as a big group of human beings, of embodied human beings. So in about 2010, there were 2 researchers that offered one of the best definitions I've found of psychological flexibility, Todd Kashdan and Jonathan Rotenberg. And they define psychological flexibility in 4 parts. It is how a person adapts to fluctuating situational demands, reconfigures mental resources, shifts perspectives, and balances competing desires, needs, and life domains. So that's a big umbrella term, which involves a lot of different aspects, but they also have a lot of research to back up why they defined it in this way and how this thing we call psychological flexibility has been proven to help those suffering with things like PTSD, with anxiety, with depression, and overall how the most resilient of us demonstrate this skill of psychological flexibility. And it is a skill, and it's one that we can build and sharpen with yoga. A little bit more about me, of course, because that's part of what I promised in this series, how these things have been relevant to my life and how they're relevant now. So I've definitely noticed growing up, and especially in my 20s, despite all of the adventures across the world and living very different kinds of lifestyles, I definitely have a tendency to cling to things. Cling to situations that I really, really enjoy, or even situations that just feel comfortable because of the pattern. There's a comfort in the pattern there that the mind likes to root into and cling to. I've experienced like really heart-wrenching breakups that have rocked me, like really put me out for several weeks or even a month, 2 months at a time, where I just don't feel quite right, and it's really challenging for me to adapt to those big changes. Losing jobs, of course, like as someone who has had a lot of different jobs throughout the past 10 years, I know what it's like to lose a job and have to change jobs and adapt to seasonal jobs. So this is another common thing that I found in my life, but also relates to others in terms of needing to adapt, like in professional work. And also outside of these big life shift situations, like the little things that happen in daily life, they're quite telling to how this skill of psychological flexibility is functioning or not so much functioning in ourselves. Like, for example, even just walking, and if you trip and are able to recover your balance right away, that's demonstrative of psychological and physiological flexibility and how they're working with the two. If your partner gets mad at you for something and then you get angry back, and there's this like clinging to this state of anger, and the anger persists for several hours or even into the next day, that's demonstrative of not having so much psychological flexibility to deal with like the emotional state and not clinging so much to emotions. So there's a pretty broad range, and yoga helps with all aspects of this because, like I say every week, yoga touches all 5 layers of the being, all 5 bodies. And I've noticed this in myself too. I'll use this morning as an example. So like I said, living off-grid for the past 2 months on a beautiful, magical island, no paved roads, no stoplights, no electricity except for like the stuff we get from solar, so no wires running throughout the walls, pretty unplugged. And what happens in a space like that is that I start to feel like super grounded and safe. I just walk through the forest and swim in the oceans and connect with friends and eat really nourishing food. And the silence at night is just like a vacuum, like the silence and the stillness. And I would lay in bed just, wow, listening to nothingness. So it provides me the space that I need to replenish. And I also notice how much it affects me at the level of the nervous system. So like my nervous system can really kind of recover and become balanced again from being so plugged in the other areas of my life and in the other parts of the world. So I came from that to 3 flights, including a red eye, to land in New York this morning, and suddenly like hundreds of people walking around really fast, lots of flashing lights and advertisements, and getting in the car and driving really fast on a highway, and hearing the noise of the traffic and planes overhead and trains. And you can imagine how this can be quite shocking to an individual. It's been shocking to me in the past when I make this transition. And I couldn't help but notice this morning, as I was driving back home, my dad picked me up and I'm hanging at my parents' place in Connecticut now, how I noticed like, whoa, I actually don't feel so out of whack right now, despite the massive shift in lifestyle from one day to the next. And I really do attribute this to a consistent yoga practice that I've really rooted into more deeply over the past couple of years. And I can feel, even though my body is a little bit tired, like the resilience, the ability to just shift and be like, okay, now I'm here. And it's not only physiologically, it's also working at the emotional level. So this sadness, this grief I experience with leaving a place that I love is always really challenging for me. And I noticed too, this time around, like the sadness is there, the grief of separation from people I love, my friends, my community is there. But I'm able to watch it and not just be completely consumed by it. So this I'm noticing as well. And it's really exciting to see how much a yoga practice has shifted my psychological flexibility and my physiological flexibility in the past couple of years. And it's just been this consistency, right, over time, setting new patterns, and in this case, setting the pattern of resilience and the ability to shift despite huge fluctuations in what's going on around me. So that's my story. That's what's going on now, and I'll continue to keep you guys posted in the next month about why I've transitioned to the East Coast and what I'm going to be offering here. And now I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the yoga works. And I mentioned this, that it's working on all the layers of the body, but mostly the physiological level, the emotional level, and also the mental level, the mental layer of the body. Physiologically, yoga helps with balancing the nervous system. I've talked about this before, how we have two main aspects of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, which involves this fight or flight response, like a call to action, and parasympathetic, which involves resting and digesting, just being able to like heal, to recover, and in general rest the bodily system so that others can come back into balance and get some good nourishment. And yoga helps in and of itself to balance the nervous system through linking breath with movement, through focusing the mind on the breath, and through training our bodies and minds to stay calm even in challenging situations. The most basic example of this is being in a challenging asana, like if you're a yogi, for example, a warrior position where you're standing, like legs are bent, arms are out, and we start to feel the fatigue and the heat building and the muscles are working. When we focus on the breath and stay calm in that asana, we're actually training the autonomic nervous system to adapt to change and stay balanced despite challenging situations. And when we do that, it over time, as we practice and sharpen this skill, it carries over into normal life, into life off the mat. For example, the situation I was in this morning when I stepped off a plane into the most like chaotic scene I've experienced in months, and I didn't even have to think, stay calm, stay grounded. I just felt it naturally. But it's because of all of the training I've done on the mat that I'm able to experience this seamless transitioning off the mat. Yoga also works to get into the actual tissues of the body to establish more flexibility. So this is obvious, like a lot of people go to yoga classes to get more flexible, but I want to emphasize here that when we work in the body and especially developing flexibility in the tissues of the body, so flexibility in the muscles and also gentle openings and attention to the connective tissues in the body, we're getting to the mind also. Like the mind, it's not just something that happens up here. Every single cell in our body has this really sharp intelligence, and if we can tap into it, we can start to break these patterns of the mind by using the body, by essentially using the embodied mind. The best example I can give of this is like how the body shows often the state of the mind. Do you know what I mean? For example, if I see someone, if a client comes to me and they sit in a chair and they're just like this, like the body seems quite closed and tense, there's usually a pretty strong connection between the state of the tissues in their body being like tense and locked and the state of the mind. So by working with a client like that to gently open up the tissues and work on flexibility, this embodied flexibility, it can also address any issues that client is having with rigidity in the mind. And this is something I see like very, very clearly. So it's a good example to use here between body, mind, and the flexibility of both. In the emotional layer of our being, Psychological flexibility helps to balance this tendency towards extremes, and this is most apt in examples of anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, these states where, or these imbalances rather, where we can like shift to an extreme of an emotion and have a hard time getting out of that extreme. And of course, from my video a few weeks ago on anxiety and depression, you know that I've been through this myself, this feeling of like sinking into an emotion, like a deep feeling of grief or sadness, and not being able to just let go and get out of it. And a consistent yoga practice works to train the mind and the body at these emotional levels to be able to like fluctuate in a more healthy way between the two. And it also helps us to not cling so much to the really ecstatic, joyful experiences of our lives too, which I mentioned before. Sometimes I felt this like, I just want to hold on to a good feeling or a good guy or a great job, and it's just not happening. And so when that exits from my life, like I can let go a little bit more lightly by maintaining this flexibility. And finally, at the mental level, the mental layer of our being, yoga works to focus the mind and make the mind still. So the mind, it's this amazing tool that we have. And if we sharpen it with the skills of yoga techniques, breathing, meditation, asana practice, we can use it exactly how we want to in whatever situation that comes up. So in other words, through yoga, we can train the mind to work for us as opposed to us being some sort of victim of the mind, of an out-of-control mind. And when the mind is very still like this, like very still and skillful and sharp, it also offers us more creativity, more openness. And this is what seems like a paradox to a lot of people, that a very consistent practice of discipline actually helps to expand the mind and make it more free and more creative. There was a dance teacher whose name is escaping me. She created 5 Rhythms Dance, if you've ever done that. And she has this beautiful quote that says, it takes discipline to be a free spirit. And I love that because it refers to not only dance and movement, but also like to our lives and to our spiritual and yogic practices, in that we need to make these like very consistent, very disciplined in order to enable this controlled expansion of the mind. Really, if you have questions about that, please send me a personal message and I'd love to talk more about it. I don't have time in this video here, but I've experienced this on quite deep levels, how a very disciplined yoga and meditation practice has enabled me and offered me so much more freedom and flexibility in my life and creativity than I could have imagined had I just tried to be a free spirit. It takes a lot of discipline. Good. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you got a little bit out of my personal stories there and the science behind why yoga works in establishing psychological flexibility. If you have any input or questions, feel free to comment below the video or get in touch with me via private message. And I hope you have a lovely, lovely weekend. Goodbye.